The evolution of peacekeeping. One of those challenges when you talk about peacekeeping is it's almost generational. Each generation sees peacekeeping slightly different, or perhaps substantively different. It depends on where you are in sort of the knowledge of peacekeeping. And when we talk about it, we go back to the 1945, right at the end of World War II, when there was this concept of having the United Nations. And the United Nations was developed to specifically do one thing. We've lost track of that over the generations as we've added the World Health Organization and UNICEF and all of the different committees that are of the United Nations. But the goal of the United Nations in 1945 was one thing. Anybody care to venture what that was?
World peace.
It wasn't even so large as world peace. It was that there would never be another Adolf Hitler. That the role of the United Nations was to ensure that there would never be another Adolf Hitler who would try for world domination and would add those things in. And in 1945, as the discussion started, there was actually a discussion, a full-blown discussion, about whether the United Nations needed a standing army, whether it would have its own Army, Navy, Air Force under its command, which countries would contribute soldiers to, airmen and sailors, but it would be maintained by the United Nations on a permanent basis. However, by 1947, it was clear that there was no appetite in the member governments to continue with having standing armies. Most people were trying to get out of that business. Most people wanted to go home after World War II. They didn't want to continue the idea of staying in uniform. And so the whole idea was passed. And there was actually a famous comment made in about 1947 by the American president at the time, who said, "We do not need a standing army at the United Nations because we've learned our lesson. We'll never go to war again." That didn't really work out so well on the prognostication records, but when it was done, there was this decision not to have a standing army. However, as we all know, it wasn't really peacekeeping, but very soon we were engaged in Korea, and there was this model of troops being loaned by countries. We all have watched. Now, again, your exposure to the Korean War and to all of these depends on where you are. If you are somewhere slightly older than me, you might remember the war as something you read about in the newspaper. Some of you may have served there, depending on your age. To put this into context, there's some people in this room, their only exposure to the Korean War is reruns of MASH on the History Channel. Well, and again, throughout this conversation, keep in mind as we talk about history, is that if you were born in 1990, neither the Berlin Wall nor Yugoslavia existed in your lifetime. Right? Stuff that we think about regularly didn't exist. I try to explain to some of my university students the Berlin Wall, and it's difficult because they have no concept of building and separating two countries by a wall. So, and the United Nations decided not to do that, but by 1956, remember, this is a history lecture. By 1956, Nasser came to power. President Nasser came to power in Egypt. He was a nationalist. There's no question, nationalist, leaned towards socialism, even communism, depending on your point of view. But he was a nationalist, and he wanted the Suez Canal back. The Suez Canal had been built by the French and British consortium that had run through. They had a 100-year lease that was nowhere near expiry, but Nasser saw it as a view of an opportunity to show the nationalism and the strength of his country. So the Egyptian troops moved into the Suez Canal zone. England and France and Israel and others pushed back with troops. This is a 30-minute presentation, so we don't have time for all the detail. But they sent troops in. They're facing Nasser. Nasser realizes that he cannot defeat the British and the French and the Israelis combined, so he calls on his friend, the Soviet Union. And so for a brief shining moment in 1956, we had three nuclear powers faced off against each other over a strip of water about 100 miles long. The UN stepped in and said, this isn't going to work. We cannot make this happen. This is not going to happen. So on November 7th, they ordered them to stop. Now, as a sort of a history of peacekeeping, the British, the French, and the Russians were all happy for a reason to disengage. All of them had sort of been drawn into this based on political issues and popularity contests at home, and so they needed to withdraw. They needed to get out of this without losing face, but no one knew how to do that. So along comes Lester B. Pearson, who, playing off of the Korean experience, says, what if we put together a group of people from various countries who were neutral and who would separate these two forces, and would give the French and the British the opportunity to say, we didn't surrender to Nasser or to the Russians, give the Russians a chance to say, we didn't surrender to the British and the French, but we in fact capitulated to the United Nations. Worked for everybody. There's a few unique things about this. I want you to notice the dates. The UN ordered a withdrawal of troops on November 7th. The first troops hit the ground on November 21st. That's 14 days to go from from nothing to men on the ground in 14 days. I wager not to the armed forces. They could do it. Could you imagine government today doing anything in 14 days? Sorry to the politicians in the room, but 14 days to get the men on the ground. The challenge was, for those of you, I'm been in Calgary, I now live here in Edmonton, but for those of us who lamented the base closing, the troops that were going from Canada to the Suez Canal zone were from the base in Calgary, and they were the Queen's Own Rifles. So they were getting on, they got on a train and got as far as Halifax, at which point Nasser pointed out that they wore the same uniforms as the British, they had the word Queen in their name, and he just didn't want them. Which became one of the hallmarks of early peacekeeping, is that the participants had to want the troops there. They had to want the UN to be there. There had to be a reason for them to be there, and so it started that, but by the November 23rd, so 2 days later, British and French forces are leaving, and Pearson's back to the drawing board, this time not designing the whole idea of peacekeeping, but rather designing the blue beret and helmet, because he realized if you can't send the Queen's Own because they're wearing a green uniform and they have the word Queen in them. By the way, Canada did send troops. The Queen's Own got to Halifax and was sent back to Calgary for a nice jaunt on a train across Canada. We sent engineers and technicians and others in place of combat troops, because Nasser wouldn't have combat troops from Canada. So we changed that. However, over time in Egypt, there have been 7,000 troops from 20 different countries have served there, 150 UN troops, including 50 Canadians. And because this is true peacekeeping, Egypt has been the most costly peacekeeping mission we've ever been on. There has been no other. Afghanistan, we can argue, is not really peacekeeping. It was sort of declared that, but it's not really peacekeeping. But it was the largest loss of life, and this gentleman, Pearson, went on to, of course, win the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize for peacekeeping. And it became a part of Canada's political and diplomatic and military policy for the rest of time. It was just part of the foundations. And until 2002, Canada was the only country in the world. In 2002 it changed, but until 2002, Canada was the only country in the world to legitimately claim that they had been on each and every UN peacekeeping mission. We never missed one until 2002, when our troops were reassigned. So Cyprus becomes a classic peacekeeping model. So one, if we talk about peacekeeping, most people speak about peacekeeping nostalgically for the Cyprus days. This is what, when you hear people in the media ask questions, it's usually construed around the question of, can we go back to the Cyprus model? Can we get back there? And the reason is that it became Canada's longest peacekeeping mission. We were there for 29 years. We withdrew in 1993, but we were there for 29 years. And the background is just simply that Cyprus, in 1959, declared its independence. It had both Greek and Turkish communities on the island. Civil war ultimately breaks out, and there's riots in the streets, and the Canadians are sent in after a peace treaty is signed to try to break up the two sides and keep them apart. Yes, you could do an entire university class on Cyprus, but the reality is it was both sides, the Greeks and the Turks. We were in a strange place. We had the Greeks and the Turks were almost at war with each other over the island of Cyprus, and this was a challenge because both were NATO members. This was not looking good. And so the UN stepped in to say we need to stop it, and it becomes the classic. Those are Canadian troops in that bottom corner on the green line. They're walking the line. If you come up and put your nose against the screen, you see they have little red patches on their shoulders. They've got the Canadian flag on their shoulders. So they're there in the green line, keeping the sides apart. But it was this idea of actively stepping between two combatants, but with a peace agreement in place. With a peace agreement in place where we would hold the line. even then, Canada suffered 2 dead and 30 wounded, and so this idea that somehow, and I know the media does this, that they sometimes make it sound like that Cyprus was simply Canadians going for walks in the park and occasionally talking down some angry Turk or some angry Greek. It was dangerous, it was difficult, it was a structure, but it was 29 years of relative routine in how we did peacekeeping, and people got used to it. What was the expectation when we sent our soldiers off to Cyprus? Anyone? They're coming home safe and sound. They're coming home safe and sound. That was the expectation. No one ever sent their son or daughter off to Cyprus saying, oh my God, what if? Because the assumption was, it's pretty easy stuff. But it wasn't. It wasn't easy, but it was, and there was a cost to it. The reality was that our next stop was going to be here. It was going to be in Yugoslavia. And all of a sudden, peacekeeping was changing. It was no longer that opportunity to keep the peace, but we had to make the peace. There had to be a place. So we had the two sides fighting against each other. There was, the country breaks apart. Again, high-level review of this, right? General Tito's in power. General Tito artificially divides Yugoslavia up to keep the sides from warring with each other. He artificially breaks it into provinces that really weren't based on history or culture or anything else, but it was politically based. Tito purposely does not name a successor. Apparently, what happens if you're a military strongman and you name a successor?
He kills you.
Yeah, your lifespan becomes very short because now the next guy knows what the reward is if he does it. So Tito purposely didn't name a successor, and so when he dies, the country breaks into chaos. There's no strong man to hold it together. There's no natural bindings in the communities. There's no natural bindings, and we have populations that are split, and so there is this massive sort of pushback on both sides, each trying to gain territory and trying to do things, and it becomes a horrific war. It becomes a horrific war. For those who went, it's true. For those of you who are going to celebrate or commemorate the Medoc Pocket tonight, it was the first time that, again, the argument is it was the first time that Canada truly was in a battle situation since the Korean War, that we were now shooting at people. And it was a complex and confusing issue. So Canada was there. We were supposed to now not just keep two sides apart and maintain a peace treaty, but we were doing things that would have made Lester Pearson turn in his grave. Stuff that he would never have anticipated peacekeeping was going to do. We were supposed to keep the peace and build a confidence between warring sides, people who hadn't put down their guns. We were going to achieve a final political solution, so we put soldiers in the place of being political negotiators, which is a challenge. Right? It's not what we're trained for or they're trained for. And it was to return normal life to Croatia and others wherever we were deployed. UN4, also the United Nations force, was now also doing things that we had never done before. We're doing Overwatch. I love the picture. It's a great story. The one with the tank in front of the house. Remember, the two sides are active. That farmhouse becomes famous in the lore because it was owned by a local Muslim leader. He was a leader, war leader, but he was a leader, and he owned the farm. So he volunteered it to the UN. He said, make a great observation post. It's on a bit of a hill, looks down a valley. I'll give you my farm as an observation post. And the UN, not recognizing the trap they were about to step into, put some soldiers and some equipment on the hill, and now it's an observation post. At which point, what do you suppose the Muslim leader did? No, not charge rent. No, didn't target it. He moved his family back into the farmhouse. So now it looked like the United Nations was taking sides because they were now protecting a Muslim leader. They threatened to withdraw, at which point the Muslims said, you can't abandon us. So the Christians were mad at them, the Muslims were mad at them. It was not a pleasant sight at all. And it was the kind of war that was into it. And so you saw the civil department at UNPRO4 were doing things like mediating between the sides. Again, not something that we would have thought would have happened. Dealing with economic issues, helping with prisoners and refugees, organizing exchanges of POW. Now, some of this is not, now you're going, well, of course we did. That's what we do now. But that was a fundamental change to how we did peacekeeping. It was putting soldiers in things that they were not trained for and not ready for, but they stepped up. There's no question. This is not a criticism of soldiers. We're talking about government policy and how this worked. So and we were making sure that convoys could move. One of the most dangerous opportunities here was for the soldiers were snipers. This was a war with a lot of snipers. There's a great. If you talk to Lewis Mackenzie, the general who was there, he tells a great story on his command change. They were changing command in a square in country, and he says it was a quiet square. He tells the story much better than I do. But he said it was a dead quiet square, and he had his counter snipers on the roof. On the roofs of the buildings, so they were watching for counter snipers for snipers as they're doing it. And he said, unfortunately, during this change of command ceremony, the sound was echoing off the buildings, so you could hear the snipers ranging and talking to each other on their headsets. So they're going, I have a target at 50 yards. It's a lady wearing a babushka. And he says this was not the tone they wanted at the UN when they were changing the command and to go there. So the war changed how we saw it and how we did things. And in fact, there were now 15,479 men from Canada, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, blah, 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 all there. 56 peacekeepers were killed and 506 wounded. So we've moved, not all Canadians, that's across the UN before. Why is this one different though? It's because this is the first time that NATO becomes involved. There is no standing army, there's no ground troops that can just sort of move in, and so NATO is asked to step up and to become a partner in this war. And it sets a tone for what's going to happen next in Afghanistan, that NATO and UN are somehow inextricably connected, that they're part of each other in some way. But it was a terrible place, there's no question. If anybody thinks this was Cyprus, remember, most of the troops, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that troops were not allowed to arm their rifles. They couldn't put bullets in their rifles without a specific command. Is that true?
Well, we had loaded mags on the rifle, maybe not around
in the chamber.
The magazines were loaded,
right,
and they were on the rifle,
but not one in the chamber. You'll notice the armored piece of equipment on top, the armored piece of equipment on top, it's 50 cal, and they're busy in a square just protecting men and women going about their daily business, shopping, etc. And the consequences of this were difficult. The soldiers came home. We started to see now, when you went to Cyprus, you weren't expecting things like PTSD. But now, coming home from this one, we were starting to see evidence of it. We were starting to see it because it was a real shooting war, and that continues today. I had the privilege of working on the movie Passchendaele with Paul Gross. Ladies, I have his email and his cell phone number, so be nice and I might share. But he went to do his movie on Afghanistan, and he went to do some. Someone remind me of the title of the Afghanistan movie? Hyena Road. And he did his research in Bosnia. And the Bosnian army gave him a armored personnel carrier and some troops to go out into the field and do some test shots, and they loaded up a 50 cal with blanks, and he was out with them and out wandering around, and they loaded off some rounds, at which point live rounds came back from the other side of the border, thinking that the whole thing was starting again. Paul tells the story that he was buried, so he got under the APC and dug a hole to get even deeper, and when he came out, the captain that was in charge of the little group that went out with them said, well, that's sort of normal. Do you want to do that again? And Paul says, not a hope in hell. We're doing that again. So there's still tensions are high. Things haven't settled, but we've moved on, and there's no question we have, because this, of course, we just celebrated our 15th anniversary of 9/11. And Canada is going to be called to do a type of peacekeeping, making something. I love the title of your speech. I'm not going to give it away, but I was reading it. I wish I'd thought of that, Laurie. But the reality is that we don't know, in terms of the vernacular of peacekeeping, what it was. But what we do know is that it was this chance for Canada to, again, punch above its weight, to be seen, to be there. And so it wasn't a traditional peacekeeping mission. It was 37 countries went together, again, under the NATO auspices. And again, speaking in this room, many people served there. And so I'm not going to give you that long sort of story of that. But the reality is, it was no longer peacekeeping. It was full-out combat. And I think the numbers are staggering when you look at them and why it was different when we went. I was doing some research the other day on World War II, and apparently, across the Allied forces, soldiers in World War II spent 15 days a year under enemy fire. The rest of the time was sort of garrison duty, waiting, but there was 15 days of combat when you were actually being fired on average per year. Some units more, some units less, but on average about 15 days. In Afghanistan, our troops were under enemy observation and fire for 247 days a year. So this stretches that sort of the patience and the abilities and the structure of a human being's mind. And this is not to say that everybody suffered from PTSD, but it's one of the reasons we wrote the book, because the proceeds from the book go to helping soldiers with that, soldiers, sailors, and airmen with that affliction. So, what are the goals in Afghanistan? Well, there were a 20% increase in the employment of women. 70%, I should point out that there are more women in the Afghan parliament today than there are in the Canadian parliament. I just point that out as a takeaway. 70% reduction in areas contaminated by landmines. Afghanistan is the second most contaminated area with landmines. Development of an army and a police, and we're still there helping do that, and we're looking for that stability. The reality was we had moved away from that whole model of stepping between two warring factions that had wanted peace, the peace treaties in place. We were not even making peace, we were fighting a war on behalf of something bigger. And for those critics out there, when the original treaty was written in 1945, they put in what was called Section 7, or Article 7. And Article 7 said that the UN could declare war on a rogue country that was part of the UN sanction, or the UN Charter. There was sort of the fail-sky. I was making a joke about not pushing the red button. It is the red button in the UN Charter, is Article 7, that the UN can declare that it's legal and has authority to attack a country who is acting in a rogue manner. And it was, remember, the original intention was no more Adolf Hitlers. And so it was applied here, and we went on to, someone will tell me the final number, I think was 156 Canadians lost their lives in Afghanistan serving their country. 58, thank you. 158, thank you. At the end. And so there were no ceasefires in place. Warfare didn't look like warfare. You were driving down the middle of, you sort of drive through an urban populous city to go out and conduct operations. It just didn't look what it was supposed to be. So we were the lead at the Kandahar reconstruction. The reconstruction team in Kandahar was ours. We did a lot of good work and we're home. The government today is looking at what should we be doing with peacekeeping. I don't know there's an answer. Maybe some of these gentlemen back here have a better answer than I do. I don't know what that's going to look like. I know that I had a chance to talk to Rick Hillier once and asked a stupid civilian question. I said, how long are we going to be in Afghanistan? And he looked me square in the eye and said, exactly as long as the Prime Minister tells me to. And so it does come down to what the government's going to do. It comes down to what the Prime Minister is going to do and what our role is going to be. I have a concern that we don't go back to the days where we send 2 or 3 people on every peacekeeping mission and say, we're there, we're doing it, but it's not really making a difference. I hope that we pick our fights, that we pick the peacekeeping missions, that we execute them as well as we have in the past, and that we do not drift back to a token focus on peacekeeping. If there's a warning I give you, a lot of my students, a lot of my colleagues and friends who are not familiar with the topic believe that Canada should just pull out of peacekeeping altogether, that it's not our role in the world. And maybe I was born in 1963, so maybe I'm in just enough as a teenager growing up in the 70s. I think Canada has a bigger role in the world than simply hunkering down behind our own borders and saying to hell with the rest of the world. And I hope that's not what we do. Thank you very much.